There's weight that comes with the word mentor.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story, and it arises out of two separate conversations that took place on the same day recently. The first one was with a friend of mine who is a recovering addict, several decades sober, and he now speaks to AA and NA groups internationally. And I've learned a lot about that community from him. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because they say in order to keep it, you have to give it away, so he has to help other people. But one thing he mentioned yesterday caught my attention. He said that he had a conversation with his sponsor. And I said, well, wait a minute, hold up a minute. Why you're like this authority figure to so many, and he's international and this. Why do you have a sponsor? I know that's a question born of ignorance. But what basically what I was asking, I didn't say this inartfully, I don't think, but what good is a sponsor to you?
Right. Yeah. Like didn't you already summit the mountain? Why do you need, right.
Correct. Why do you still need a Sherpa? So he said that he speaks with his sponsor at least once a week. And it's not necessarily, to check in. I mean, obviously they're there to help you in case you feel the urge for whatever your addiction is, a drink or something else. But to talk through some difficult times, because he has an addictive brain, as he says. And so he wants to make sure that his reactions in any area are not falling into a trap that the addictive brain would set. So it's not necessarily I have a bottle of scotch in front of me and I'm thinking of taking a slug. It's that, to make sure that his thinking is still in line with the thinking that got him to the summit. So that's one conversation. And I was fascinated by the continuing need for a sponsor when you've summited. Mm-hmm. But the other conversation, same day, was with a former student of mine. And she was basically, she had asked me to be her mentor. And she was wondering, as many people do, what to do with their life, and is she doing the right thing? And she was feeling unsure. And I love.
By the way, do you have those answers?
No. And that's the point of the story. So I love it when students call me, and I really think the world of her. But I didn't want to say, well, yes, of course I'll be your mentor, because I didn't have a clear idea of what that meant, because I didn't want to do that unless I thought I could do it well, I could serve her well and fulfill the purpose that she wanted, which was not to tell her, oh, this is what you should do with your life. But it was really, I think, to be a sounding board, help her evolve and all that stuff. So those two conversations came together in what is it that's necessary to be a good mentor? And I asked my friend that during the conversation, what is it that's necessary to be a good mentor? And it's not exactly at what stage do you stop needing one, but how do you best use one, even when you've traveled as far up the mountain as many people have. Certainly, if you've been in a profession for 30 years, you've done something. So it got me thinking about mentorship and menteeship. And so the last thing that I'll say,
doubtful, but go ahead.
This little segment.
Please let that not be true, or it's going to be really awkward for the rest of the episode.
Is I asked my friend, I said, well, what are your rules? Because mentorship, what are your rules when people ask you to be a sponsor? Because that's not unlike people asking to be a mentor. It's
sure.
And he said, well, one is that there's going to come a time when we're going to break up. It could be when one of us dies, but it's going to be a time when one of us breaks up. But if it's not death or disability, then one of the rules is that we have to, if any one of us wants out, we can get out at any time, but we have to have an honest conversation about that. We have to talk about that.
Yeah.
Second rule, which he says is no a-holes. I won't do that. A third rule is that you have to be committed to making progress. And then the fourth rule is you have to be unfailingly honest. So if I say, did you do this? And you think what I want to hear is that you did, or what I want to hear is that this resonated with you or you thought about that. But the answer is no, you have to tell me no, because I don't want to waste my time.
Right.
And so it got me thinking about the rules of being a good mentor, the rules of accepting mentorship, and the rules of being a good mentee and who you look to, particularly when you've accomplished things in your profession and you're not new as a professional.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to talk to you about and see what your thoughts were.
So I love this conversation. I know you didn't do it for me, but this actually helps think through some of the things I was asking you about with that speech I'm trying to write. So I'm like, oh, this is very helpful, Elliot. Thank you. So one other thing I will point out, the fact that students call you later after they're gone to get your guidance about their life is another form of a compliment. So
No,
I hope I haven't just ruined it for you. So anyway, okay, back to the topic. It's interesting because I think words matter, and I think there's baggage isn't the right word I want for this, but there's weight that comes with the word mentor, I think sometimes.
There's a lot of weight, yes.
Yeah. And certainly there's weight or gravity, kind of, not weight necessarily in like burden, but there's a gravity to being a sponsor as well, certainly in the context of AA and NA. And but then in the ways that you were first describing that relationship when the guy was talking about his sponsor, it also sounds more like that kind of like sounding board gut check. I want to make sure I just want somebody else to validate in the full breadth of that word validate, not validate like rubber stamp. Yes, you're right. But also sometimes be like, no, that's wrong. Like, watch out. And I think there's actually some use to blurring all of those together because for a couple of reasons.
Well, before you say that, let me just say that when you talk about the validation and when you talk about, having somebody in that role, one thing that's inherent in that is that the person that is in that role has to know you pretty well.
Yes.
So you can't go to somebody, on some sort of call for 10 minutes and they're saying, oh, this is what your problem is and this is what you have to do. I mean, I guess you could, but that's not inherent in this relationship is that you've taken the time to develop that relationship.
Yeah, because I could post on Facebook, what should I do in this, or is this a good idea? And I'll get a full breadth of yeses and nos and everything in between. So not only is that not helpful, but you're right. It is the real question is this a good idea for me?
Right.
Does this, that's really the question I'm asking. Is this right for me? What do I need to do differently? Or is this going to move me closer to or further away from what I want? It's actually why I struggle with every time someone says like, you should write a book. I'm like, no, that's the problem because there's what I love doing is like teasing apart your particular answer for a thing, not someone else's answer. So anyway, I digress.
Well, one of the things that you just said, is this going to move me closer to or further away from what I want? And I think the what I want part is such a key part of this because I think to be successful, a sponsor or a mentor has to have at least some sort of feeling of what you want, even when you're not able to articulate that. They at least know you well enough to help that process of figuring out what that thing is.
To reorient you back to yourself, because I think this is what's complicated in the world. And it's funny that when I was at the architecture firm, we were doing a pinup some Friday happy hour kind of thing, and it was an orientation center. It might have been the one at Mount Vernon. I don't remember which one it was, but probably because that one's mostly underground. And so they were talking about the role of these windows. And I remember whoever was presenting said, and this is so important because in an orientation center, as opposed to like a museum building, and they're both, so it probably was Mount Vernon because they did both an orientation center and a museum. They're like side by side. In an orientation center, if at all possible, you want to take opportunities to have sight lines out to the property or, whatever you are orienting them for so that they can stay oriented and they don't go into a building, have an experience, and then come out with no attachment to what they're seeing. So like Washington's Mount Vernon, there's a place where they're talking about something and there's a window that has a sight line, I believe, to the mansion house. So that you're kind of like, oh, okay, I know, like you're talking about that. And I've now also created some sort of connection to what I'll see when I go outside instead of having
metaphor.
to, right? Yeah. I know, it's an amazing metaphor. And I think, not in a mentor standpoint, but that came to me yesterday. I was thinking about that exact metaphor because I was talking to a client. I got an email from a client said, what do you think about adding this? And I, in that moment, was answering the question. And I'm seeing if I can make this point in a way that will translate without having to go into all the details, because that would be boring. But I was like, oh, I think about this, then think about this. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, but don't forget the whole reason you're doing this thing is because of X. And you're worried about this like litany of Y things that are actually, and that's the whole point to what you're saying. Like nothing about the conversation we were having about Y that he brought up, not WHY, but in this case, X versus Y. Those were all valid points. There was a valid conversation, but all of a sudden my mind almost forgot to orient back to but that's not who you're talking to with this ad. You want to attract this kind of person. So don't go into great detail about worrying about what this other kind of person might think and answering all their questions, because then they might call you and that's not who you want to come to the thing. So don't forget, you only want to talk to these people. So that what mentors can do is mentors, sounding boards, therapists, coaches, your lawyer. I mean, that's what I love about your empty hourglass thing. Having people who can reorient you back to yourself, whether it's remembering what you want or remembering who you are, remembering where you're headed. It's like when you can reorient people back to that, then they tend to know what the next thing is. It's almost like the confusion happens when you're getting off that path and you're sort of bringing somebody back to the path.
Yeah, and I think that part of it kind of dovetails with with one of our last episodes, which was, what kind of success don't you want? Like in your example with your conversation, this ad, I think you said, doesn't appeal to the people that are really within your sightline, within your mission, or doesn't speak to them. So if you had success in that, he would be attracting people that really don't, an audience that doesn't represent success. And I think in this context, there's also something about being able to help somebody recognize valuable failures as well as invalid success, or success that is not great for them.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was wondering. And, it was interesting because you said on the mentorship side, you said, so Elliot, do you have those answers? Because, and that's what I struggle with, because the answer is obviously no, I don't. And so how do you decide that how can you be valuable in the mentorship side when you don't profess to have all of the answers from on high?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you my answer to that, which is I don't think, well, how do I want to say this? It's not that I started saying nobody has the answers from on high. People have answers. I really question if anyone's answers are applicable to anyone else. I think they're great to throw out as like, here's a thing to consider, or just say, here's an option that maybe you haven't thought to consider. However, I think there's actually a real problem with the broader concept of mentorship, because I think it often looks and sounds like more like teaching or guide, like I'm going to guide you on a path. And I guess there's some point to that. Like if you're signing up, at a dojo or something, you really want a mentorship. You want to be schooled in a thing or learn a thing versus, some of our most valuable conversations. In fact, you just reminded me this of the other day was, I can tell you exactly where we were, what coffee shop we were sitting outside of. And I was having a bit of a crisis of a month. And there was a point, and I'm sure you gave me lots of I'm making air quotes, like guidance, like, have you thought of this? What about this? Like what I think people would think of as mentorship. But the moment I remember, And the moment that actually served me more than all the others was the one where you said something like, you said something that reset me, reoriented me back into who I am. You said, you're so disconnected from the part of you that knows what it wants and knows where you're going. When you get back to that part and you talk about, you already know what your next thing is. And so it's like, it's a little bit like that drawers metaphor we used a few months ago of like, I had all my drawers pulled out and I was wobbly on top of it and you like shoved them all back in. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, right. I have a better sense of what I need to do and where I need to go. And that to me is the real value of mentorship.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And one of the things inherent in that is that I don't think it's different from teaching, because in the dojo, the sensei might be saying, this is exactly how you have to do the forms. And it's repetition, it's repetition, it's repetition. This is exactly what you need to do. But on the mentorship, it's getting them back to who they are so they can make whatever decision is right for them. Because I think you're exactly spot on, which is even if I thought I had all the answers for me, which I don't, I certainly should have enough insight to know I don't have all the answers for anybody else.
Yeah.
And so this brings me to another point that I think is kind of interesting. One is the danger of my saying, well, here's an option, and having somebody who has come to me for advice interpreting that as more of a directive, And so the point that it made me think about is the danger of, I think, selecting a mentor in your workplace, somebody who is in the chain of command, because I think that it starts to get messed up. Well, if I don't do what I think she wants me to do, then there are these other ramifications. And so that, I think that goes into part of it, the freedom to consider and disagree.
I think in any kind of formal structure is problematic. I think it's also good to have somebody who will watch out for any kind of people-pleasing behavior. And I think that's on both parts of just being aware of, well, if I come to you to talk a thing through, if I leave with any amount of, well, I don't want Elliot to think that I'm not moving forward fast enough, so I'm going to go ahead and act. Like, that's dangerous. I'll be honest, that's one of my beefs with coaching sometimes, like in the way that I think of it is, I think there's, there are times where what people need is to be nudged forward into action. And there are also a lot of times where what people need is to let their own process unfold. And there's an art to knowing the difference. And I have seen circumstances where there is that, like, almost, well, I want to do a good job, so I'm going to do what the coach said, or as the coach is like measuring your success in how much people take actions that you talked about. Right. And then you held them accountable to that. Like, I get a little squirrely about accountability. I'm like, as long as you are dead nugget certain that is exactly the right action for somebody, then accountability, like, it's only valuable if it's in the right way. I mean, I really value sometimes when a client comes back and says, hey, I did not do that thing we talked about. I'm like, great, talk to me about why. Because there's a huge difference between I just blew it off, or I was afraid, so I didn't. But if that's the case, great conversation probably doesn't just show up in that part of your life. Like, it's an important place. And sometimes they're like, because I realized that's not my next best move. I was walking down that path and I realized, I need to be doing this. Great. It's just all sort of surfacing the truth of a thing in layer by layer. But
yeah, and I think that's the key, is these are these necessary conversations, and these almost fearless conversations. Like, one of the steps in AA that we were talking about was the fearless moral inventory. And I apologize if I got that wrong, but it's really an assessment of where you've been, what you've done. But the word fearless is in there because it's got to be absolutely honest. And so, and in that, this is slightly off point, but it follows the same vein. One of the things that my friend told me, I said, well, how do you choose to be a sponsor? Because I'm sure people come to you and you're like, no, it's just not the right fit. So what is it? And he said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, first, they have to ask for a sponsor. And I don't mean that they have to be in the room and go, hey, I need a sponsor. Right. Because he says that's kind of weak. That chicken's out. They have to come to me and they have to ask me. And he says, and particularly men, because in my experience, this is him talking, men are much more reluctant to ask for help. So you have to have the courage first to go to another human being and say, I want your help. And then they have to express why. And the why isn't just their own feelings. I feel I need help, I feel whatever. But the why has to be, I feel like you could do this, or I could get this out of that relationship, or this is how I want to progress. It says, and if they've developed the thinking, then it means that they've put effort into what the relationship looks like, as opposed to the cop out of, well, the solution is I'm going to tick the box and ask somebody to be a mentor or ask somebody to be a sponsor. And I thought that was really interesting about the first step having to come from the person, from the mentee or the person needing sponsorship.
That is interesting. I had some, the first thinking in the context of AA, I was like, wow, that's setting a really high bar for somebody who's trying to like dig out of a hole. But then it sort of clicked for me. It's not unlike, a number of times I've had someone reach out to me because either they want me to work with an employee or their partner or a spouse or whatever it is. And I'm always, my immediate answer is I'm happy to talk with them, but unless they're like super excited to get on the other side of the seesaw, it's not happening because it won't work. Like they really do have to want, it has to be their own want and desire. So I get that. I think it's also really important. I mean, that's sort of some thoughts from in order to agree to be a mentor or a sounding board or whatever it is. I think there's also a consideration on the like who you seek out for mentorship side of it, which is, and maybe it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about knowing you, but it has to be somebody who doesn't just know you, but gets you and like gets you with your particular quirks. Like it reminds me that very first person when we were very, very new to podcasting, that I found that person who had all these amazing credentials. And I was like, oh, and this person really knows. And I won't say the credentials because somebody might figure out who it was. And I was like, this is great because this person has done all these things that we admire and blah, blah, blah. And the phone call, thank God it wasn't video, because you and I were just staring at each other with this like, oh my God, because every single thing she recommended was the opposite of what makes us us. It was almost like a Saturday Night Live skit where every single thing she said we should change were the things people were telling us they loved about the show. Yeah. And which is kind of cool because I'm like, that's great. And this is the point. She might be right in certain contexts. Her guidance has probably made other shows more successful than they were by following her guidance, but not ours, because it wouldn't work for us because she would be shaping us into something that we are not. And it doesn't make her wrong. It just makes her wrong for us. And so you have to have somebody who gets who you are so that their feedback is you-shaped and not making you into something that you're not, or devaluing the things that other people value, or, I think that's a super important piece.
So speaking of important conversations, where can, beyond this episode, people have important conversations about this topic?
I was like, I can tell you're leading me, but I don't know. Why, Elliot, are you thinking about our Facebook page, our Facebook group? What are you talking about? So a couple of things. One, I do want to say one more thing, and then I'll do the Facebook group. If you'd like to join our Facebook group, we really are having some fantastic conversations in there. So you can, if you go to our Facebook page, so here's my story, there's a link right there for the group. That's probably the easiest way to find it. You can also get it from our website. So here's mystory.com. And if you get on the email list, you'll get your own personal little invite link. So those are the fastest ways to get there. But I do want to mention, you said something about, there was one thread that we haven't hit on that I thought was super important, which is are you too grown up for a mentor? Are you too advanced for a mentor?
Right.
There's this fantastic article and it's super short that I have, and it's actually called Dismantling the Myth of the Self-Reliant CEO. I have it linked on my website, so I was able to pull it up quickly while we were talking here. Because what I love about it is it actually this person did a bunch of research, and it's written about startups, but I think it applies to all kinds of companies, about how actually the more the company grows, the further advanced you get, the more successful companies have either coaches or therapists or belong to peer CEO groups, or have people who they lean on to vet ideas, to have thoughts validated or invalidated, and just to have that double check in to get back to okay, it's what I think of as actionable clarity is how I think of it. When having these people that when you talk a thing through, you're sure enough, because let's face it, in the world of business, there is no certainty. It's always a roll of the dice. It's always a gamble. So just enough clarity that you can take that first next action and then be presented with a whole bunch of other choices that may or may not be obvious. And so I just thought it was really interesting to actually see some data and some statistics that validate the fact that this is not something you outgrow, that it is something business owners need all the way through and to the end and past on the other side.
And it also validates one of the foundations of this podcast, which is you should not be alone.
Never. I thought I'd just leave you alone on that for a second.
Last word. I got the last word.
Alone.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.